Hello, we will now begin the graduate seminar for Week 7, focusing on the focus of Scripture, literature, genre prophetic literature. Andreas J. Kosenberger and Richard D. Patterson, Back to the Future, Prophecy, in Invitation to Biblical Interpretation, exploring the hermeneutical triad of history, literature, and theology. Welcome, scholars, to the foundational academic background of our 7th week in this advanced graduate seminar. Today, we cross the threshold into the intricate and deeply intentional world of biblical literature, focusing intensely on the structural and poetic mechanics of the text. As we prepare to engage with complex prophetic literature later in the course, we must first master the underlying literary canvas, which is the Old Testament historical narrative and the profound mechanics of Hebrew poetry. Let us begin by examining how the ancient authors established the very boundaries of their texts. As Andreas Kosenberger and Richard Patterson state in their seminal work, Invitation to Biblical Interpretation, before the interpreter begins his examination of the narrative, he or she must determine the limits or boundaries of the narrative. This sounds deceptively simple to us today, but in the context of ancient Near Eastern manuscripts, this is a formidable and critical task. Modern readers are entirely accustomed to chapters, headings, and distinct paragraph breaks, all of which were introduced centuries later by editors and translators. The original audiences and readers navigated a continuous stream of text. Therefore, the biblical authors had to embed the structural architecture directly into the grammar, syntax, and narrative flow of the text itself. This brings us to a fascinating cognitive and compositional tool. Kosenberger and Patterson note, an author often arranges his material in such a way that at the end of the narrative he will return to a theme, subject, or words mentioned at the beginning. This technique is known by such names as bookending or inclusio. Think of an inclusio as an envelope. By opening and closing a literary unit with identical or closely related terminology, the ancient writer provides a psychological and structural boundary for the audience. It clearly tells the hearer, here begins the thought, and here the thought concludes. It brackets the narrative, ensuring the reader does not blur the theological boundaries of the pericope. But the literary artistry certainly does not stop at the borders. Within these boundaries, the authors organize their historical accounts with breathtaking and deliberate symmetry. The authors observe, quoting J. T. Walsh, that subunits in historical narrative accounts may be organized symmetrically as parallel sequences or in such a way that attention is called to the center of the account. Consider the profound cognitive balance this creates. In 1 Kings chapter 13, the tragic and complex story of the man of God and the old prophet unfolds in exactly this parallel sequence. The first half details the old prophet hearing news, speaking to his sons, finding the man of God, speaking God's message, and seeing its tragic fulfillment in a lion attack. The second half perfectly and rhythmically mirrors this exact progression, hearing news of the death, speaking to his sons to saddle the donkey, finding the body, confirming the Lord's message, and providing the theological conclusion regarding the dynasty of Jeroboam. This parallel sequence stresses the absolute need for the exegete to conduct a comparative examination of the details. The text is demanding that we look at the hinge, the center, and the mirrored elements. It is not merely recording history, it is interpreting history through its very structure. Furthermore, Walsh suggests that historical accounts can be formed in concentric symmetry, such as A, B, C, B', A', or chiastic symmetry. Although both are traditionally termed chiasms, the single center structure forms a crucial hinge to both halves of the subject. In many cases, this center becomes the main, undeniable emphasis of the subunit. If we fail to map these boundaries and structural forms, we risk imposing our modern, linear, Western logic onto an ancient, holistic, Semitic text. We must learn to read with the grain of the text, tracing the architectural blueprint laid down by the original authors under divine inspiration. Doing so is the first and most crucial step in the hermeneutical triad of history, literature, and theology. Having established how to map the boundaries of a text, we must now turn our critical attention to the environment in which the biblical action unfolds. Narrative does not occur in a vacuum, it is anchored in the vivid realities of space, time, and human culture. As our textbook points out, understanding the setting of a given narrative can be crucial to its interpretation. Interpreters should take note of several factors and ask themselves questions such as, is the physical location significant to the action of the story? This is a paramount question for any exegete. The physical setting is often an active participant in the biblical drama, not merely a painted backdrop. To illustrate this, the authors direct our attention to the magnificent account of the Battle of Taanach found in Judges chapters 4 and 5. The Canaanite commander, Sisera, strategically picked a place for battle in the wide expanse of the eastern Esdraelon plain. From a purely military standpoint, this was a brilliant tactical move because the flat, open terrain perfectly favored his technologically advanced iron chariots. However, the text reveals that recent rains had left the battlefield soggy and his chariots bogged down in the mire, leaving them virtually helpless. The heavy iron, which was Sisera's greatest asset, became his fatal liability in the mud. At that precise moment, Barak swept down from the high vantage point of Mount Tabor, and the Lord routed the enemy. Here, the physical geography and the weather conditions not only contribute to the theological understanding of God's sovereign control over nature, but they add an incredible vividness to the account. Time, as a dimension of setting, is equally potent. The authors astutely observe, time may also contribute to the dynamics of the narrative. Thus Jacob, who was already apprehensive regarding his meeting with Esau, finds himself alone at night. Nighttime in the ancient Near East was a period of intense vulnerability, associated with danger, cold, and the unknown. In the pitch darkness, carrying the heavy burden of guilt and fear, Jacob has a violent, physical encounter with the angel of the Lord. The night setting doubtless made the encounter significantly more frightening and disorienting for Jacob. The careful reader will not miss the psychological and theological drama of it all. Finally, we must cross the vast chasm of time by understanding the cultural setting. The text reminds us, knowledge of the cultural background is especially important because of the great distance in time and differences between ancient and modern societies. If we approach the Book of Ruth with a modern, Western mindset, we will completely misread the narrative. To understand Ruth's midnight encounter with Boaz on the threshing floor, we must understand agrarian harvest customs. To understand the climax of the book in chapter 4, we must comprehend the ancient legal customs of conducting business at the city gate, the redemption of property by a kinsman redeemer, and the complex institution of Levirate marriage. Without this cultural scaffolding, the profound theological themes of redemption, loyalty, and God's providential care are entirely lost in translation. Therefore, rigorous research into geography, chronology, and culture is non-negotiable for the biblical scholar. Now that we have established the setting, we move to the engine that drives the narrative forward, the plot. As scholars, we must view the plot not merely as a sequence of random historical events, but as a carefully constructed theological argument. The textbook defines it clearly. By plot we mean the ordering of events in the story. Plot is concerned with the arrangement of details by which the story has a beginning, middle, and end. Each part of the story contributes to the fabric of the whole. The biblical authors were master editors, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, selecting and arranging historical data to teach profound spiritual truths. The authors state that, the plot in biblical stories usually revolves around a conflict or contest, whether physical, psychological, or spiritual, and suspense. To master narrative analysis, you must identify the primary conflict and trace the tension. A brilliant example provided by the text is found in the court tales of Daniel chapters 2 through 7. Let us look closely at chapter 5. The story has a clear setting. King Belshazzar is throwing an arrogant, blasphemous banquet, praising pagan gods while drinking from the sacred goblets looted from the Jerusalem temple. The exposition is established, but then a massive conflict violently disrupts the scene. A crisis develops when the disembodied fingers of a human hand appear and begin writing on the plaster of the palace wall. The phenomenon causes absolute terror among the elites. No Babylonian wise man can decode the message. At this exact point of high suspense, the story takes a decisive turn, what literary critics call the crisis point. The Queen Mother remembers Daniel, he is summoned, he interprets the message of divine judgment, and the plot swiftly moves to its resolution. That very night, Babylon falls, and the theological claim that Yahweh is sovereign over the empires of men is vindicated. The plot structure carries the theology. Furthermore, the authors introduce a vital literary concept: narrative plots may also take the form of archetypal plot motifs. By archetypal plot, we mean features or experiences that are common to mankind. The Bible utilizes deep, universal structures that resonate across all human cultures. Among the many that can be catalogued, the text highlights the quest motif, where a hero endures severe obstacles to achieve an appointed goal, as seen in the ascent of David to the throne. There is the tragedy motif, where matters begin with immense promise but collapse due to a fatal flaw, a pattern deeply evident in the reign of King Saul. Finally, there is the journey motif, where a protagonist faces external dangers that catalyze deep internal character growth, perfectly exemplified by the life of the patriarch Abraham. Recognizing these archetypes allows the exegete to understand how the biblical text taps into the universal human condition while presenting unique, divinely revealed truth. Plot and action are entirely dependent upon the agents within the text. This brings us to the fascinating study of biblical characterization. In modern Western literature, we are accustomed to deep psychological novels where the narrator spends pages exploring a character's internal thoughts and motivations. Ancient Hebrew narrative is vastly different, it is remarkably sparse and reserved. As the text notes, the close association between plot and character may be observed in the fact that it is the character who generates the action that makes up the plot. Yet the reader seldom receives a detailed description of a character's full nature or personality. In the Bible, you learn who a person is almost exclusively by what they do and what they say. To analyze these agents, literary critics utilize specific categories. The authors explain that a character is often described as being round, flat, or simply an agent. Let us break these down. A round character is full-fledged and possesses many intersecting, sometimes conflicting, traits. They appear complex, they struggle, they grow, they fail, and therefore they feel profoundly real to the reader. Think of King David or the prophet Elijah. Conversely, a flat character has essentially one dominant trait and seems one-dimensional. They exist in the narrative to represent a singular force or ideology. Finally, an agent has almost no personality to speak of, they are functional pawns that simply move the story's plot along. For example, in the gripping narratives of 1 Kings 18-22, both Elijah and King Ahab are highly complex, round characters. We see their bravado and their deep fears. However, Queen Jezebel operates as a flat character, she is consistently and singularly wicked, driving the conflict without nuance. Beyond these dimensional categories, characters are identified by their structural roles. There is the protagonist, the main hero or focus of the story, like Ruth. There is the antagonist, the individual relentlessly opposing the protagonist, such as Goliath or Ahab. And crucially, there is the foil. A foil is a character intentionally placed in the narrative to provide a stark, illuminating contrast to someone else. The frightened obedience of Obadiah serves as a perfect literary foil to the bold, confrontational faith of Elijah. Recognizing these mechanics is vital for interpretation. It transforms ancient figures from distant statues into vibrant, breathing people. But we must never forget the most critical interpretive key: behind all the patriarchs, prophets, and kings, the real, ultimate hero and central protagonist of Israel's history is Yahweh himself. God is not a passive observer in the shadows, he is the supreme actor orchestrating the grand narrative of redemption. As we transition from structure and character to the actual prose style of the biblical authors, we encounter a feature that modern readers often find confusing, but which is the absolute lifeblood of ancient literature: repetition. If you have ever read through the Old Testament and felt that a story was repeating itself unnecessarily, you were witnessing a brilliant literary device, not a mistake. The text asserts that biblical narratives are often filled with various types of repetition. Indeed, repetition is perhaps the most widespread and widely recognized stylistic feature of biblical narratives. Why is this the case? In a largely oral culture, where texts were read aloud and heard rather than read silently in a book, repetition served as the primary mechanism for emphasis, memorization, and thematic development. The authors detail that repetition may include plays on sounds or roots, keywords, themes, motifs, repeated dialogue, or repeated action sequences. Think about the massive structural themes that echo across the canon. The concept of the third day appears repeatedly as a marker of divine intervention and spiritual emphasis, from Mount Sinai to the resurrection. The covenant theme is the rhythmic heartbeat of the entire Bible, echoing from Abraham to David to the blood of Jesus Christ. Another profound characteristic of Semitic narrative is the exact, verbatim repetition of speeches or dialogue. For example, when King Rehoboam foolishly decides to oppress the Israelites in 1 Kings chapter 12, the text repeats the harsh advice of his young counselors word for word. Furthermore, action sequences are frequently repeated in groups of 3 to build narrative tension. Joseph's life revolves around 3 distinct sets of dreams. The young boy Samuel hears the voice of the Lord 3 distinct times in the night before Eli the priest finally realizes what is happening. By understanding this convention of repetition, the astute interpreter will avoid the trap of modern critical scholarship, which often falsely assumes that repeating elements are the clumsy patchwork of later editors or redactors. Instead, we see the masterful hand of a single author building suspense. Closely related to repetition is the technique of highlighting. The narrator will repeatedly call particular attention to a specific detail or foundational character trait. Despite Joseph's complex life in Egypt, his unwavering purity is consistently highlighted. No matter David's profound moral failures, the text constantly highlights that he was a man who possessed a heart for God. These literary techniques are the author's way of ensuring the reader does not miss the main theological point amidst the historical details. While biblical narrative is deeply serious in its theological intent, we must never make the mistake of thinking it is devoid of sharp wit, dark humor, and piercing mockery. The biblical authors frequently employ irony and satire to subvert the expectations of the reader and to expose the utter foolishness of rebellion against God. The textbook defines irony clearly. Irony has to do with the reversal of what is said or expected. Old Testament narratives are filled with many such instances. Let us first consider verbal irony, where the surface meaning of the text appears to be the direct opposite of its intended meaning. A chilling example occurs in the book of Job. In the midst of unparalleled suffering, Job's wife tells him, "Bless God and die." But the context makes it blindingly obvious that she actually means, "Curse God and get it over with." The author utilizes the Hebrew word for bless as a dark euphemism, and we must translate the irony to grasp her despair. Beyond verbal irony, the Bible is saturated with dramatic irony. This occurs when the narrator imparts a crucial piece of information to us, the readers, that the characters inside the story are completely blind to. The textbook provides a fascinating example regarding King David's sinful census. While David believes he is simply measuring his military might, the author of 1 Chronicles pulls back the cosmic curtain to reveal to the reader that Satan, permitted by God's sovereign judgment, is actually the instigator behind David's prideful decision. The reader watches the tragic events unfold with a sense of dread, possessing divine knowledge that the human actors lack. Closely allied to irony is the biting weapon of satire. The authors note, satire consists of an attempt to demonstrate through ridicule or rebuke the vice or folly of that which appears to be improper or ill-conceived. When the biblical writers confront the arrogance of pagan empires or the absurdity of idolatry, they often deploy satire. Look at the contest between the young shepherd David and the massive warrior Goliath. The narrative exposes the giant's terrifying taunts as entirely wrong-headed and foolish. What the giant's pagan gods and massive armor could not accomplish, a boy with a sling achieved through the power of Yahweh. The mighty warrior is ultimately decapitated by his own sword. Perhaps the most famous use of satire is the prophet Elijah on Mount Carmel. As the prophets of Baal frantically cut themselves and scream to the heavens with no answer, Elijah ruthlessly taunts them. He suggests their God might be deep in thought, busy, traveling, or perhaps taking a nap and needs to be awakened. This satirical mockery is not petty, it is a profound theological statement exposing the lifeless impotence of false idols compared to the living God of Israel. Having thoroughly examined the mechanics of historical narrative, we must now dramatically shift our interpretive gears. As we continue our canonical journey through the scriptures, we encounter the magnificent genre of poetry and wisdom literature. Reading poetry requires an entirely different set of hermeneutical tools than reading prose. The textbook points out a fascinating technical reality regarding the original Hebrew language. In addition to a host of positive features that distinguish poetry from prose, certain prominent features that occur frequently in prose are rarely found in poetry. These include especially the definite article, the relative particle asher, and the sign of the definite direct object. In other words, the Hebrew poet strips away all the connective grammatical tissue, leaving only the raw, powerful, essential nouns and verbs. This creates a dense, rapid-fire impact on the listener. Furthermore, in contrast to prose, which constructs its sentences and paragraphs around narrative discourse, episodes, or scenes, poetry is built around individual lines, which commonly feature the heightened use of imagery and figurative speech. When we read Western poetry, we look for a rhyme of sound at the end of the line. But ancient Hebrew poetry operates on a completely different genius, it relies on the rhyme of thought. The authors declare that the most recurring feature of Hebrew poetry is repetition. This can be seen especially in the poet's use of parallelism, the practice of using similar language of approximately the same number of words and length, and containing a corresponding thought, phrase, or idea over succeeding lines. Parallelism is the engine of biblical poetry. The most common form is similar parallelism, where the second line mirrors the thought of the first line. However, we must heed a critical warning here. We must guard against the naive idea that the poet is simply saying the exact same thing in two different ways to be repetitive. As literary scholar Robert Alter observes, there is almost always a heightening or intensifying of meaning in the second line. The poet moves from a standard term to a more elevated or specific term. Take Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the works of his hands. The second line advances the thought, moving from the abstract glory of God to the intimate, anthropomorphic image of God crafting the skies with his very own hands. Interpreting poetry means analyzing this subtle, powerful movement from line to line. While similar parallelism builds upon corresponding thoughts, biblical poets also possessed a vast arsenal of other parallel structures to convey meaning. Let us explore the brilliance of antithetic and progressive parallelism. The textbook notes, rather than similarity of thought, some parallel lines may display a sharp contrast. This is known as antithetic parallelism, and it is the dominant structural device in the book of Proverbs. The author sets two opposing realities side by side to force the reader to make a moral choice. For example, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a disgrace to any people. The sharp contrast highlights the binary nature of biblical wisdom. There is the path of life, and the path of death, there is no middle ground. Beyond contrast, poets utilized progressive parallelism, where a succeeding line supplements, advances, or completely finishes the thought introduced in the first line. The text provides several intricate variations of this. In staircase parallelism, succeeding lines begin with similar phraseology, building a sense of intense anticipation that leads to a climactic completion of the thought. It sounds like a drumbeat building in intensity. A specialized variation is the terrace pattern. Imagine actual stairs built into a hillside. In this pattern, the progression is facilitated by taking the words at the very end of the first line and repeating them at the very beginning of the second line, creating an interlocking chain of thought that pulls the reader forward. Furthermore, progression is frequently indicated by utilizing a numerical sequence, wonderfully termed ladder parallelism. You will recognize this immediately from Proverbs. There are three things that are too amazing for me, for that I do not understand. The poet gives a base number, and in the parallel line, raises it to the next highest digit. This is not arbitrary mathematics. The numerical sequence acts as a literary spotlight, directing special, intensified attention to the final element in the list. It also served as a highly effective mnemonic device, an aid to memorization in an oral culture. Other forms include alphabetic acrostics, like Psalm 119, where successive lines begin with sequential letters of the Hebrew alphabet, signifying total, comprehensive coverage of a topic. All of these varied structures require the exegete to slow down, analyze the architecture of the verse, and determine exactly how the poet is manipulating the lines to drive home their theological truth. To truly appreciate biblical poetry, we must understand how it operates on the human mind differently than prose. The textbook identifies three interrelated characteristics: terseness, concreteness, and imagery. First, let us look at terseness. The authors state, poets have a way of stating their thoughts so concisely that the result is a polished and succinct presentation free of unnecessary details. Because the poet removes the connective grammar, what remains is an explosive concentration of words. Consider Nahum's terrifying description of the attack against Nineveh: the crack of whips, the clatter of wheels, galloping horses and jolting chariots. It is rapid, breathless, and economically brilliant. Second, poetry is defined by its concrete nature. While theologians love abstract concepts like omnipresence and immutability, poets speak the language of the senses. As quoted in the text, poetry allows the reader to see, taste, touch, smell, or hear the matters which the poet portrays. A masterclass in this contrast is the death of Sisera. The prose account in Judges chapter 4 tells us the basic facts: Sisera fled, Jael gave him shelter, and she killed him while he slept. It is straightforward history. But the poetic account in Judges 5 is brutally concrete. It focuses the camera lens directly on the action. She struck Sisera, she crushed his head, she shattered and pierced his temple. At her feet he sank, he fell, there he lay. The poetry forces us to feel the visceral reality of God's judgment. This leads directly to the fourth characteristic, the abundant use of imagery. The biblical poets thought in vivid images rather than Greek philosophical abstractions. Because the writers are attempting to describe the infinite, invisible God of the universe, they must utilize figurative language drawn from the physical world. The authors catalog several types. There are anthropomorphisms, which ascribe human physical characteristics to God, such as speaking of God's mighty arm, his observant eyes, or his listening ears. There are anthropopathisms, which ascribe human emotions to God, describing his fierce anger, his deep grief, or his tender compassion. Strikingly, there are even zoomorphisms, where animal qualities are ascribed to God. The psalmist writes that under God's feathers and wings we will find refuge, like a mother bird protecting her young. Conversely, the prophet Hosea describes God as a ferocious, tearing lion to the rebellious tribes. The careful interpreter must recognize these figures of speech. If we fail to understand metaphorical imagery, we risk falling into grievous theological error, attempting to view God as a physical being with actual wings or human limbs, rather than recognizing the profound spiritual truths these sensory images convey. As we conclude our foundational survey, we must break a common misconception. Many believers assume poetry is strictly an Old Testament phenomenon confined to the Psalms and Proverbs. The textbook powerfully corrects this. We will do well to remember that with the possible exception of Luke, the New Testament authors were all Jewish by background. When it came to poetry, therefore, they would likely think in terms of Old Testament precedents. If we look closely through the lens of Hebrew poetry, the New Testament explodes with verse. As Leland Ryken observes, Jesus is one of the world's most famous poets. His sermons and discourses are essentially poetic in style. When Jesus says, "Ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened," he is utilizing flawless, climactic Hebrew parallelism. The Beatitudes, the woes to the Pharisees, and the profound, "I am" discourses in the Gospel of John are saturated with metaphor, imagery, and rhythmic balance. Understanding Old Testament poetry is the direct key to unlocking the teachings of Christ. Consider the prologue of John's Gospel. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God." This is not standard prose, it is arguably the most carefully crafted, majestic poem in the entire New Testament, utilizing brilliant imagery of light and darkness. To analyze these poems, whether in Psalms or the Gospels, we must understand their architectural building blocks. The textbook explains that poetic structuring begins with the individual line known variously as a stitch, verset, or colon. A single, independent thought is a monocolon. 2 parallel lines form a bicolon, and 3 lines form a tricolon. These small blocks are grouped together into strophes, and strophes are gathered to form large stanzas, much like paragraphs in prose. But how did the ancient poets glue these large stanzas together? They utilized a technique called stitching. This is the practice of linking successive units of a poem by purposefully repeating a catchword, phrase, or idea at the end of one stanza and the beginning of the next. Finally, authors would structure entire compositions using massive macrostructures. We have already discussed chiastic structure, where the second half mirrors the first half in reverse order. But the textbook also introduces bifid structure. This occurs when the poet brilliantly structures his material into 2 massive halves, where each section of the second half answers directly to a corresponding section in the first half, in the exact same basic order. By recognizing these intricate structural devices, from the smallest colon to the massive bifid structures, we uncover the breathtaking genius of the biblical authors. They were literary architects, guided by the Holy Spirit, crafting vessels of beauty strong enough to carry the eternal weight of divine revelation. Welcome, scholars, to the heart of our seminar on biblical interpretation. Today we are plunging into the deep waters of prophetic literature, historical narrative, and ancient poetry, as laid out in the magnificent scholarship of Andreas Kosenberger and Richard Patterson. We begin our journey by looking at how an exegete actually approaches a text. Before you can interpret a story, you must know where the story begins and where it ends. This sounds simple, but in ancient Near Eastern literature, it is a profound challenge. The authors remind us that before the interpreter begins an examination of the narrative, they must determine the limits or boundaries of the narrative. An important Semitic compositional technique is particularly helpful here. An author often arranges his material in such a way that at the end of the narrative he will return to a theme, subject, or words mentioned at the beginning. Think of this like walking into a massive, ancient cathedral. You do not just stare at the stones, you look for the architectural boundaries, the arches that define the space. In biblical literature, this framing technique is called an inclusio, or bookending. It tells the reader, here is the scope of my thought. But the architecture gets even more complex. Jerome Walsh, a brilliant scholar of biblical narratives, points out that these historical accounts are often organized symmetrically. They are not just linear events moving from point A to point B to point C. Instead, they operate as parallel sequences. Walsh uses the pattern ABC followed by a prime, B prime, C prime. Let us look at a fascinating example from 1 Kings chapter 13, the strange and tragic story of the old prophet and the young man of God. The narrator balances the story in 2 perfect halves. In the first half, the old prophet hears news of the man of God, speaks to his sons to saddle his donkey, finds the man of God, speaks a prophetic message, and then watches that message become fulfilled. That is the first sequence. Now, watch the literary genius of the Hebrew author in the second half. The old prophet hears news of the young man's death, speaks to his sons to saddle his donkey, finds the man's body, confirms the prophetic message, and this event serves as the ultimate fulfillment of the downfall of Jeroboam's dynasty. It is a mirror image. Why does the author do this? Because this parallel structure forces the reader to conduct a comparative examination of the details. You are meant to lay the 2 halves of the story over each other and see where they match and where they deviate. Walsh also introduces us to concentric symmetry, the ABC B'(A' structure, and chiastic symmetry. When you find a chiasm, the center of that structure, the single hinge upon which the entire narrative swings, is almost always the main theological emphasis of the text. As you study these texts, do not read them through modern, Western lenses. You must train your eyes to see the symmetry, to trace the parallel sequences, and to find the theological heartbeat hidden in the center of the literary architecture. This requires patience, meticulous diagramming, and a deep respect for the profound literary sophistication of the ancient biblical authors. Moving forward, we must examine the stage upon which these ancient dramas are played. I am talking about the setting. In modern novels, the setting is often just window dressing, a pretty background to frame the dialogue. But in biblical narrative, understanding the setting is absolutely crucial to interpretation. The biblical authors do not waste words. If they tell you where an event happened, when it happened, or the cultural customs surrounding it, that information is vital to unlocking the text. Let us consider physical location. The authors ask, is the physical location significant to the action of the story? The answer is almost always yes. Take the magnificent account of the Battle of Tanakh in Judges chapters 4 and 5. The Canaanite general Sisera is a military genius. He chooses the wide, flat expanse of the eastern Esdraelon plain for the battle. Why? Because he commands a terrifying force of heavy iron chariots, and chariots need flat ground to maneuver and crush infantry. Humanly speaking, the Israelites under Deborah and Barak are doomed. But you must read the setting. A sudden, massive rainstorm hits. The Kishon River floods. That beautiful, flat battlefield turns into a sticky, deep mire. Sisera's invincible iron chariots sink up to their axles in mud, becoming utterly useless metal traps. Barak sweeps down from the high ground of Mount Tabor, and God grants a massive victory. Without understanding the geography and the weather, the theological point of God's sovereignty over nature is lost. Now, consider the element of time. Time contributes profoundly to the emotional and psychological dynamics of the narrative. Think of Jacob in Genesis chapter 32. He is terrified that his brother Esau is coming to kill him. The text specifically places Jacob alone, at night, in pitch darkness. In the ancient world, night was a time of terror, vulnerability, and spiritual dread. It is in this blinding darkness that Jacob wrestles with a mysterious man who turns out to be the angel of the Lord. The night setting amplifies the sheer terror and the desperate drama of Jacob clinging to God for a blessing. If this happened at high noon, the psychological weight would be entirely different. Finally, we must immerse ourselves in the cultural background. There is a massive chasm of thousands of years between our modern society and the ancient Near East. You cannot properly interpret the Book of Ruth without understanding ancient customs. When Ruth goes down to the threshing floor at night to meet Boaz, or when Boaz sits down with the elders at the city gate to handle a legal dispute, you are looking at deeply ingrained cultural institutions. You have to understand the intricacies of property redemption and the ancient law of levirate marriage, where a man is obligated to marry his deceased brother's widow to carry on the family name. As Donald Leggett points out in his extensive research, these are not just quirky ancient habits, they are the legal and theological frameworks through which God's loyal love, or hesed, is demonstrated. If you ignore the geography, the time, and the culture, you are effectively reading the Bible with a blindfold on. You must step into their world. Now we turn our analytical focus to the concept of plot. When we use the word plot, we are talking about the highly deliberate ordering of events within the story. Plot is the strategic arrangement of details that gives a narrative its beginning, its middle, and its definitive end. Every single part of the story must contribute to the fabric of the whole. According to literary scholars like G. W. Brandt, biblical plots do not meander aimlessly, they are incredibly tight and focused. They almost always revolve around a deep conflict or a high-stakes contest. This conflict might be swords clashing on a battlefield, it might be intense psychological warfare in a king's court, or it might be a cosmic spiritual battle against dark forces. And woven into this conflict is suspense. The biblical authors are masters of making the reader feel curiosity, absolute dread, eager anticipation, or profound mystery. As a scholar, you must map out how these elements interact. The authors point us to the court tales of the book of Daniel, specifically chapters 2 through 7, as absolute masterpieces of plot construction. Look at the architecture of these chapters. They all follow a brilliant pattern. First, a clear setting is established. Then, terrible trouble develops, a crisis so profound that the pagan wise men are utterly baffled. Only the hero, empowered by God, can resolve it. And the resolution always results in a reward that serves as a massive testimony to the sovereignty of the God of Israel. Let us dissect Daniel chapter 5. King Belshazzar is throwing a lavish, blasphemous banquet. He is drinking wine out of the sacred vessels stolen from the Jerusalem temple. That is the beginning. Then, the crisis hits like a thunderbolt. The fingers of a disembodied human hand appear and write a cryptic message on the plaster of the palace wall. Absolute panic ensues. The king is terrified, his knees are knocking together, and his sorcerers are useless. Here, the plot takes a decisive, suspenseful turn. The queen mother remembers Daniel. Daniel is summoned, he confronts the king with his arrogance, and he interprets the terrifying decree. The plot resolves that very night with the catastrophic fall of the Babylonian Empire. It is brilliant pacing. Beyond these specific structures, you also need to recognize what we call archetypal plot motifs. Archetypes are foundational narrative shapes that resonate deeply with the universal human experience. Recognizing them helps you grasp the theological thrust of the story. For example, there is the motif of the quest, where a hero must endure seemingly impossible obstacles and trials before achieving his divinely appointed goal, much like young David surviving the wrath of Saul. There is the tragedy and deliverance motif, where circumstances take a sudden, horrific turn for the worse, only to end in miraculous success, as we see when Daniel is thrown into the lion's den. And there is the journey motif, where the hero faces continuous physical dangers as he moves from place to place, but those very dangers are the crucible that forges his character, exactly as we see in the life of Abraham. These plots are not just entertainment, they are the vehicles God uses to reveal his character and his redemptive plan. Plot is driven by people. The close association between the storyline and the characters is evident in the fact that it is the characters who generate the action. But here is a critical hermeneutical rule: biblical authors do not write like modern psychological novelists. You will rarely find a detailed physical description of a character, and you will almost never get an internal monologue explaining their deep-seated neuroses. In the Bible, you know who a person is by what the omniscient narrator explicitly tells you, and by watching what the person actually does. The eminent scholar Tremper Longman III gives us a highly useful framework for analyzing character complexity. He divides them into three categories. First, we have round characters. A round character is full-fledged. They have multiple traits, they struggle with conflicting desires, they make surprising decisions, and they feel complex and real to the reader. Think of King Ahab or the prophet Elijah. Ahab is wicked, yes, but he also uniquely humbles himself and repents in sackcloth at one point. Elijah is a powerhouse of faith on Mount Carmel, but later he is suicidal and terrified in the desert. They are round. Second, we have flat characters. A flat character has basically one defining trait. They are one-dimensional. They do not grow or change, they are a constant force. Queen Jezebel is the perfect flat character. She is a monolith of pure, unrelenting wickedness and pagan zealotry from the moment she enters the text until the dogs eat her in the streets. Third, we have agents. Agents possess almost no discernible personality. They exist simply to run errands, deliver messages, and move the plot from one scene to the next. Structurally, we must also identify the roles these characters play. You must find the protagonist, the main character whose journey we are following, like Ruth or David. You must identify the antagonist, the central opposing force, like Goliath or Ahab. And you must pay special attention to the foil. A foil is a character intentionally placed next to another character to create a glaring contrast. Obadiah, who hides God's prophets in caves, serves as a foil to Jezebel, who slaughters them. Esau's crude, immediate appetite for stew is a foil to Jacob's cunning, long-term desire for the birthright. Recognizing these literary devices elevates your exegesis. it makes the ancient text burst with dramatic realism. But above all this literary analysis, you must never forget the supreme theological reality of the Hebrew Bible. As Leland Ryken and others remind us, behind every human protagonist in the Old Testament stands the ultimate, true hero of Israel, and that is God Himself. God is not sitting aloof in the heavens, occasionally whispering stage directions. As Moses declares in his great victory song in Exodus chapter 15, Yahweh is a man of war. He is the central, active, dominating player in the grand narrative of redemption. As we delve into narrative style, we encounter what is perhaps the most defining characteristic of ancient biblical storytelling. I am speaking about repetition. In modern Western writing, we are taught by our English teachers to avoid repeating the same words. We are told to use a thesaurus, to find synonyms, to vary our sentence structures. The ancient Hebrew writers had exactly the opposite philosophy. For them, repetition was the ultimate tool for emphasis, for controlling the pace of the story, and for burning the text into the memory of an oral culture. David Howard points out that biblical narratives are filled with seemingly endless catalogues of repeated actions. A character will say they are going to do something, and then the narrator will repeat the exact same words to confirm that they actually did it. You must learn to read this not as bad editing, but as high literary art. Repetition takes many forms. Sometimes it is a brilliant play on words and root sounds. Take the story of David and Abigail in 1 Samuel 25. Abigail says of her wicked husband, he is just like his name. His name is Nabal, and folly is with him. The Hebrew word for fool is Nabal. The author is hammering home the character's nature through the repetition of the root word. The biblical authors also endlessly repeat major themes and motifs. Notice how often major spiritual breakthroughs or deliverances happen on the third day. Notice how the imagery of the Exodus, passing through the waters, wandering in the wilderness, being delivered from slavery, is repeated over and over by the later prophets and right into the New Testament. Then there is the fascinating use of repeated dialogue. When King Rehoboam decides to reject the wise counsel of the elders and listen to his foolish young friends, the author does not just say he took their advice. He makes Rehoboam repeat their disastrous, arrogant advice verbatim. This forces the reader to hear the sheer stupidity of the king's decision twice. It is a brilliant highlighting technique. Furthermore, action sequences are very frequently grouped in sets of 3. This creates a rhythm of tension and release. Think of Joseph's life, which pivots entirely on 3 distinct pairs of dreams. Think of the young boy Samuel sleeping in the tabernacle. The Lord calls him, Samuel runs to Eli. This happens once, twice, 3 times before the old priest Eli finally realizes the Lord is speaking. The repetition builds the suspense. Israel's apostasy in the book of Judges operates on a massive cycle of repeated rebellion. Here is a vital warning for your exegesis: coming to grips with the convention of repetition will save you from making massive scholarly errors. Over the last century, many higher critics have seen repetition and wrongly assumed that multiple authors or editors clumsily pasted different documents together. By recognizing repetition as a deliberate, sophisticated literary device, you respect the integrity and the profound artistry of the biblical text. Now we move to the sharper edges of biblical narrative style, irony and satire. Some people read the Bible as if it is entirely stoic, wooden, and devoid of humor or sarcasm. This is a tragic misreading. The Old Testament authors wield irony and satire like razor-sharp swords to expose the utter foolishness of human pride and idolatry. Irony fundamentally has to do with the reversal of what is expected or what is literally said. Take the devastating moment with Job's wife in Job chapter 2. She looks at her ruined husband and says, literally in the Hebrew, "Bless God and die." But scholars uniformly recognize that she is speaking in bitter irony. She actually means, why not curse God and get it over with? The author uses the holy word bless as a dark euphemism to highlight her despair. We also see massive structural irony. The entire book of Esther is built on it. The wicked Haman builds a towering gallows specifically to hang the righteous Jew, Mordecai. Through a series of providential reversals, Haman ends up hanging by his neck on the exact same gallows he built. That is divine irony. Then there is dramatic irony. This is a sophisticated technique where the author whispers a secret into the ear of the reader, giving us information that the characters in the story do not possess. When David takes a census of his army, he thinks it is a good administrative idea. Joab thinks it is a bad idea. But in 1 Chronicles 21, the author explicitly tells the reader that Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to do it. As we read the story, we feel a terrible tension because we know the demonic origins of the census, while David is completely blind to it until the judgment falls. Closely related to irony is satire. Satire is the attempt to demonstrate the absolute vice or folly of something through biting ridicule. The biblical authors love to satirize the enemies of God. Look at the story of David and Goliath. Goliath is presented as a walking tank, a mountain of armor and bronze shouting terrifying taunts. But the narrator exposes him as entirely wrong-headed. All the armor and false gods of Philistia cannot stop a smooth stone thrown by an ill-equipped shepherd boy. The ultimate satire is that the giant is decapitated by his own massive sword. Ahab delivers a brilliant piece of secular satire to the boasting Syrian king Ben-Hadad, telling him, "Let not him who girds on his armor boast like him who takes it off." In other words, do not brag about winning the war while you are just putting your boots on. But the pinnacle of theological satire is Elijah on Mount Carmel. The prophets of Baal are screaming and cutting themselves, trying to get their God to send fire. And Elijah starts to mercilessly mock them. "Shout louder," he says. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he is taking a nap and you need to wake him up. The Hebrew word translated as busy even carries the connotation that perhaps Baal is in the restroom. It is fierce, biting sarcasm meant to totally humiliate the false religion. When you read the text, you must look for the irony and the satire. They are powerful theological weapons. To truly grasp these principles, we must put them into practice. The textbook provides an outstanding sample exegesis of 1 Kings chapter 19, the story of Elijah fleeing to Mount Horeb. This analysis perfectly models the hermeneutical triad, history, literature, and theology. Let us start with the literature. The author maps out the grand structure of chapters 17 through 19. It is a dramatic narrative arc. It begins with a prologue, God calling Elijah. It builds through development as he ministers to the widow at Zarephath. It hits a crisis point when he confronts King Ahab. It explodes into the climax on Mount Carmel where fire falls from heaven. And then we hit chapter 19, which serves as the denouement. The tension unwinds as Elijah flees into the wilderness. Finally, there is an epilogue with the calling of Elisha. Look at the history. We are in the 9th century BC, during the reign of Ahab. This is not just a dry historical date, it represents an era of utterly devastating spiritual drought, engineered by Ahab and his wicked Sidonian wife, Jezebel. Now, look at the characterization. Elijah is clearly our protagonist, and Jezebel is the terrifying antagonist. But watch what the narrator does to Elijah. He deconstructs him. The fearless man of faith who just slaughtered hundreds of pagan prophets on a mountain is gone. In his place is a terrified, exhausted, severely depressed man running for his life from a single angry queen. He sits under a broom tree and asks God to kill him. This is brilliant, realistic characterization. He is a round character who has cracked under the pressure. The angel of the Lord serves as a literary foil, patiently feeding and guiding the broken prophet. And once again, we see that Yahweh is the true hero of the story. God sustains Elijah, corrects him, and recommissions him. Finally, we arrive at the theology. The careful interpreter will notice a massive web of literary allusions. Elijah journeys for 40 days and 40 nights. He goes to Mount Horeb, which is another name for Sinai. He hides in a cave. There is an earthquake, a wind, and a fire. Every ancient Hebrew reader would immediately think of Moses receiving the law. God is recreating the Sinai experience for Elijah. But there is a shocking reversal. God is not in the wind. God is not in the earthquake. God is not in the fire. He speaks in a gentle whisper. What is the theological payload here? The profound lesson is that living for God does not always take place in the realm of the spectacular, the miraculous, or the fiery showdowns. Much of our service to the Lord happens in the quiet, mundane realities of life. It is found in humble, obedient listening. By synthesizing history, literature, and theology, the narrative yields its deepest treasures. We now transition from the sprawling battlefields and royal courts of historical narrative into the intense, concentrated world of biblical poetry and wisdom literature. This brings us to chapter 6 of our text. While some modern scholars, like James Kugel, have argued about where exactly to draw the line between prose and poetry in ancient literature, there is absolute consensus that poetry makes up a massive portion of the Bible. You must read poetry differently than you read prose. Prose builds paragraphs and scenes. Poetry builds individual, tightly packed lines. If you look at the Hebrew text, poetry looks and sounds different. The poets strip away the connective tissue of the language. They frequently drop the definite articles, the relative particles, and the direct object markers. They use fewer prepositions. This makes the language dense, fast, and heavily reliant on imagery. The absolute heartbeat, the fundamental structural mechanic of Hebrew poetry, is parallelism. Parallelism is the practice of laying two or more lines of poetry side by side, making them roughly the same length, and connecting them with a corresponding thought or idea. The most basic form is what we call similar parallelism, traditionally known as synonymous parallelism. This is where the second line seems to say the exact same thing as the first line, just using different words. But here, we must pay very close attention to the brilliant literary scholar Robert Alter. Alter warns us never to assume the poet is just lazily repeating himself. The formula is rarely A equals B. Instead, Alter argues that the second line almost always heightens, intensifies, or specifies the meaning of the first line. Look at Psalm 19, verse 1. The heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the works of his hands. The first line is beautiful, using a standard theological term, the glory of God. But the second line intensifies it. It brings in the deeply intimate, anthropomorphic imagery of God working with his own two hands like a master craftsman. It is an advance in thought. We also see inverted similar parallelism, where the grammar of the second line is flipped backwards. In Psalm 78, verse 10, the English reads, "They did not keep God's covenant and refused to live by his law." But the Hebrew literally reads, "They did not keep God's covenant, and in his law they refused to walk." By inverting the grammar, the poet rams the words, covenant, and law, right up against each other in the center of the phrase, highlighting the sheer rebellion of the people. When you read Hebrew poetry, you must constantly ask yourself, what is the similarity here, and where is the profound advance in the second line? Parallelism is a vastly versatile tool. If similar parallelism is about comparison, antithetic parallelism is about sharp, aggressive contrast. The wisdom literature relies heavily on this. Proverbs 14 says, "Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a disgrace to any people." You place the light right next to the dark so the contrast is glaring. The prophet Isaiah uses a devastating compound antithetic parallelism in chapter 1. He says, "The ox knows his master, the donkey his owner's manger, but Israel does not know, my people do not understand." The contrast is terrifying. He is saying that dumb beasts of burden have more spiritual sense and loyalty to the one who feeds them than God's chosen covenant people do. Next, we have progressive parallelism. This is where the second line does not repeat the first, but rather supplements it, answers it, or completes the thought. Psalm 57 reads, "Have mercy on me, O God, for in you my soul takes refuge." The second line provides the causal reason for the cry in the first line. There are several highly specialized, beautiful forms of progressive parallelism. We have staircase parallelism, where successive lines begin with the exact same phrase, stepping up the intensity toward a climax. Psalm 96 says, "Sing to the Lord a new song, sing to the Lord all the earth, sing to the Lord, praise his name." It is a staircase of ascending praise. We have the terrace pattern, where the poet takes the last phrase of the first line and uses it as the first phrase of the second line, linking them together like a chain. Sometimes they use a hinged terrace, where one phrase stands in the middle and does double duty for both lines. We also find ladder parallelism, which is a numerical sequence. You have heard this in Proverbs, "There are three things that are too amazing for me, for that I do not understand." This was a very common poetic device in the ancient Near East. It builds anticipation. You know the climax is coming on the final number. We must also mention alphabetic acrostics. This is where each line, or stanza, begins with the next successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Psalm 119 is the most famous example. This wasn't just a clever parlor trick, it was a powerful memory aid for an oral culture, and theologically, it communicated totality. When a poet wrote an acrostic about the law of God, he was saying, "I am praising God's word from A to Z, from Aleph to Tav." It is exhaustive. Finally, we have emblematic parallelism, where the poet uses a simile to draw an emblem or a picture. Psalm 103 says, "As a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him." This often sets up an a fortiori argument, an argument from the lesser to the greater. If a flawed, human father can show deep compassion to his weeping child, how much infinitely more will the perfect, eternal God show compassion to his people? As we continue to dissect the anatomy of biblical poetry, we must look at two of its most powerful characteristics, terseness and concreteness. Let us start with terseness. Hebrew poets were masters of economy. They hated wasted words. Terseness is the art of stating a thought so concisely, stripping away so much grammatical fat, that what is left is a polished, lethal, rapid-fire presentation. When the prophet Nahum describes the coming destruction of the brutal Assyrian capital of Nineveh, he does not write a long, flowing paragraph. He fires off short, explosive bursts of nouns. The crack of whips, the clatter of wheels, galloping horses and jolting chariots. Charging cavalry, flashing swords and glittering spears. You can literally hear the rhythm of the language accelerating. The syntax is violently compressed to simulate the absolute chaos and blinding speed of a cavalry charge. That is the power of terseness. The sister to terseness is concreteness. Michael Travers beautifully states that poetry allows the reader to see, taste, touch, smell, and hear the matters the poet is portraying. Philosophers speak in abstractions, poets speak in concrete, sensory realities. They do not talk about the concept of danger, they put a roaring lion right in front of your face. We have the perfect laboratory to see the difference between prose and poetry right in our Bibles. The death of the Canaanite commander Sisera is recorded twice, once as historical prose in Judges chapter 4, and once as a victory poem in Judges chapter 5. The prose account is detached, chronological, and matter-of-fact. It tells us he fled to Jael's tent, she gave him milk, he fell asleep, and she drove a tent peg through his temple. It is informational. But then we read the poetic song of Deborah in chapter 5. The poet zooms in like a camera macro lens on the visceral horror and triumph of the moment. He asked for water, she gave him milk, in a bowl fit for nobles she brought him curdled milk. Her hand reached for the tent peg, her right hand for the workman's hammer. She struck Sisera, she crushed his head, she shattered and pierced his temple. At her feet he sank, he fell, there he lay. Notice how the poetry actually slows down the perception of time. The prose speeds right past the death. The poetry makes you stand there and watch it happen in agonizingly slow motion. You hear the hammer strike. You see the massive warrior sink and fall at the feet of a woman. It is deeply concrete, sensory, and unforgettable. Prose informs the intellect, but biblical poetry is designed to assault the senses and break the heart. Because poetry is concrete, it breathes the air of imagery and figurative language. Tremper Longman wisely notes that an image conveys not just data, but evokes a powerful emotional response. The poets do not write systematic theology textbooks, they paint masterpieces of comparison. You must understand the precise grammatical tools they use to do this. First, we have the metaphor, which is a direct identification. Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd." Second, we have the simile, which compares things using like or as. Ezekiel 34, "As a shepherd looks after his scattered flock, so will I look after my sheep." Third, we have hypokatastasis. This is a bit more obscure, but it is an implied comparison where you simply call one object by the name of another. Psalm 80, "Hear us, O Shepherd of Israel." In all three, the poet is generating the visual and emotional comfort of a shepherd protecting his vulnerable sheep. But we must tread carefully here, because the poets use massive, startling imagery to describe the infinite God. They use anthropomorphism, which is ascribing human physical parts to God. The Bible talks about God's hands, his eyes, his ears, and his strong right arm. They use anthropopathism, which is ascribing human emotions to God. In Hosea chapter 11, God speaks like an agonized parent, "How can I give you up, Ephraim? My heart is changed within me, all my compassion is aroused." And they even use zoomorphism, ascribing animal qualities to God. In Psalm 91, God covers the believer with his feathers and wings like a protective mother bird. But in Hosea chapter 5, God says he will be like a great lion to Judah, tearing them to pieces and carrying them off. These are staggering, terrifying, and beautiful images. Now, here is your supreme hermeneutical imperative as interpreters. You must make the mental leap to understand these as literary figures. If you fail to recognize anthropomorphism, you will stumble into catastrophic theological error. You will end up reading verses about God's hands and eyes, and you will wrongly conclude that God is a physical, biological being sitting on a cloud somewhere. But Jesus explicitly taught in John chapter 4 that God is spirit. He is eternal, infinite, and without physical parts. The biblical poets knew this. They used human and animal imagery not to limit God to a physical body, but to communicate his furious, passionate, and active engagement with his creation in language that our finite minds can actually comprehend. You must feel the weight of the metaphor without crushing the theology beneath it. It is a common mistake among students to think that poetry belongs exclusively to the Old Testament, while the New Testament is just Greek prose and theological essays. But we must remember the cultural matrix of the Bible. With the possible exception of Luke, the New Testament authors were Jewish. Their minds were steeped from childhood in the cadence, the rhythm, and the structures of the Hebrew Psalter and the prophets. When they wrote in Koine Greek, they carried those poetic, parallel structures right over into the New Testament text. Leland Ryken, a masterful literary critic, makes the bold claim that Jesus Christ himself is one of the world's most famous poets. Jesus rarely delivered dry, abstract theological lectures. He spoke in brilliant, unforgettable images. His sermons are essentially poetic in style. Listen to the Sermon on the Mount. It is pure parallelism. Ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened to you. That is textbook similar parallelism. Jesus uses fierce antithetic parallelism. Every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. He uses progressive staircase parallelism in Luke 9, "Whoever welcomes this little child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me." If you want to understand the teachings of Jesus, you have to apply everything you know about how poetry works. But it is not just the Gospels. As we read the epistles, we frequently stumble upon magnificent early Christian hymns embedded right into the text. The most famous is the Carmen Christi, the Christ hymn in Philippians chapter 2. Being in the very nature of God, made himself nothing, being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself. Many scholars believe the Apostle Paul took an existing worship poem that the early church was already singing and wove it into his letter to teach about humility and the Incarnation. And we cannot discuss New Testament poetry without marveling at the prologue to the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. Andreas Kosenberger notes that this is one of the most beautiful and carefully crafted poetic portions in the entire New Testament. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It uses a mesmerizing step parallelism, grabbing the last word of a sentence and making it the first word of the next. It moves from the Word, to life, to light, to the ultimate antithesis of the darkness that cannot overcome it. When you read the New Testament, do not just read it for data. Listen for the music. Listen for the poetry of the early church declaring the glory of Christ. Now we must put on our lab coats and examine the microscopic anatomy of a biblical poem. How are these magnificent pieces of literature actually built? Poetic structuring begins with the individual line. In academic biblical scholarship, we refer to a single line of poetry as a stitch, a verset, or most commonly, a colon. That is colon. Understanding how these cola are grouped is the key to unlocking the structure of the text. The most foundational element is the monocolon. This is a single, solitary poetic line that stands completely independently. It does not have a parallel partner. Why would a poet do this? Often, it is used to introduce a massive theological concept that governs the whole poem. Psalm 18 begins with a monocolon, I love you, O Lord, my strength. That single statement hovers over the entire rest of the psalm. Sometimes a monocolon acts as aposiopesis, which is a fancy Greek term for a sudden, dramatic break in the flow of thought. The prophet Joel is describing a terrifying apocalyptic army, and suddenly he breaks the rhythm with a single cry, bring down your warriors, O Lord. It acts like a sudden cymbal crash in a piece of music, demanding your absolute attention. Next, we have the bicolon. This is the pairing of two parallel lines. The bicolon is the bread and butter of Hebrew poetry. It is everywhere, especially in the book of Proverbs. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. That is a perfect bicolon. Then we have the tricolon, which is a grouping of three parallel lines. Poets frequently use tricola to mark the boundaries of their text. If you are reading a long string of bicola, and suddenly you hit a tricolon, the poet is usually waving a flag telling you, we have reached the end of this stanza, prepare for a transition. Psalm 16 ends beautifully with a tricolon, you have made known to me the path of life, you will fill me with joy in your presence, with eternal pleasures at your right hand. It brings a sense of grand finality. While 4-line tetracolons and 5-line pentacolons exist, they are quite rare. So, how does this all build together? Individual cola combine to form what we call a strophe, which is somewhat equivalent to a paragraph in prose. One or more strophes then combine to form a stanza, which is a major thematic block of the poem. When you map out a complex prophetic song, like Habakkuk chapter 3, you can literally see the architectural blueprint. You see the prophet alternating between bicola and tricola to build tension, define his strophes, and transition between his stanzas. It is mathematically precise and spiritually profound. Once you have mastered the microstructures of the individual lines, you must zoom out and look at the macrostructure. How does the poet hold the entire masterpiece together? They do this using several key compositional indicators. First, we return to the concept of bookending, or inclusio. Just as we saw in historical narratives, poets use this technique to enclose whole poems. It acts as a frame for the portrait. Psalm 103 is perhaps the most glorious example in the Psalter. David opens the poem by speaking to his own inner being, praise the Lord, O my soul. He then embarks on a breathtaking 20-verse exploration of God's forgiveness, healing, and fatherly compassion. And how does he bring the poem to a close? He returns exactly to where he started, praise the Lord, O my soul. Everything in between those two statements is governed by that command. The second major technique is called stitching. Think of a master tailor sewing a quilt. To connect two different patches of fabric, he runs a single, brightly colored thread from one patch directly into the next. Biblical editors and poets did this with words and concepts. We see entire psalms canonically stitched together. If you read Psalm 134, it ends with a focus on praising God in His house. The very next Psalm, 135, picks up that exact theme of praise in the house of the Lord. And 135 ends by focusing on God's goodness, which perfectly stitches it to Psalm 136, where every single line ends with, His love endures forever. This tells us the book of Psalms is not a random scrapbook, it is a highly curated, intentionally structured theological collection. Stitching also happens internally. In Psalm 146, the poet will mention the concept of a refuge in stanza 1, and then explicitly use the word fortress in stanza 2, linking the thoughts together. We must also look for hinge verses. These are brilliant transitional verses that act like a swinging door between two rooms. They contain elements of the stanza that just ended, and hints of the stanza that is about to begin. Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 8 is a perfect hinge, pivoting the prophecy from God's judgment of the nations to His eschatological restoration of the earth. Finally, you must train yourself to spot sudden grammatical shifts or the use of refrains. In Psalm 42 and 43, the psalmist repeatedly interrupts his own poetry with a chorus, Why are you downcast, O my soul? Put your hope in God. Every time you hit that refrain, you know one movement of the poem has ended, and the next movement is beginning. We have reached the final layer of our exegetically seminar, dealing with advanced macroarchitecture and the acoustic design of biblical poetry. Some poems are built with such staggering geometric precision that they resemble the architecture of a great temple. The most famous of these is the chiastic structure. We mentioned this briefly in narrative, but it is dominant in poetry. A chiasm is where the second half of a composition mirrors the themes of the first half, but in reverse order. It forms an X shape, driving your eye down to a single, central core emphasis. Psalm 27 verse 14 is a microchiasm. A. Wait for the Lord. B. Be strong and take heart. A prime, and wait for the Lord. The emphasis is in the center, having a strong heart. Sometimes, entire chapters are chiastic. But here I must issue a very severe academic warning. Do not become a chiasm hunter. Many graduate students fall into the trap of ingeniously trying to force a chiasm onto a text that simply does not have one, building entire theories on a single repeated preposition. If the chiasm is real, it will be undeniably clear in the major themes of the text. Another major architectural form is the bifid structure. A bifid structure splits the poem directly down the middle into two massive halves. But unlike a chiasm which reverses order, a bifid structure repeats the exact same logical order in the second half. The prophets Nahum and Zephaniah both structure their terrifying prophecies in bifid halves. They declare doom, develop the theme, and give the application. Then, in the second half of the book, they repeat that exact same sequence with new imagery. Finally, we must talk about what is tragically lost in English translation, the acoustic design of the Hebrew text. These poems were not just meant to be read on parchment, they were meant to be sung, chanted, and spoken aloud. They utilized rhyme, but not the complex rhyming of Shakespeare. Hebrew rhyme was usually achieved through grammatical suffixes. If a poet wanted to rhyme, he might end 4 consecutive lines with the pronoun me, producing a repetitive nay, 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 nay sound in the Hebrew. Even more powerful was their use of assonance and alliteration, playing with the harsh or soft sounds of the consonants. We all know Genesis 1 verse 2, the earth was formless and empty. In Hebrew, that is a beautiful, echoing sound, tohu wabohu. But listen to how the prophet Nahum uses sound to describe the violent, total destruction of a city in Nahum chapter 2, verse 10. In English it reads, destroyed, despoiled, and denuded. It's fine, but it lacks punch. But listen to the violent, staccato, machine gun rhythm of the original Hebrew text, buka umebaka umabolika. The repetition of the harsh B and Q sounds creates an acoustic nightmare for the listener. It sounds like buildings collapsing and stones shattering. The biblical authors were literary geniuses. When we understand their limits, their settings, their plots, their characterizations, their parallelisms, and their acoustic brilliance, the text explodes with new life, and the theology of the Word of God takes root deeply in our minds and our hearts. Part 3, Conclusion and Application, Exegetically Synthesis of 1 Kings 19. As we transition into the concluding application of our study, we must deeply look at how theory translates into practical pastoral and academic work. Kosenberger and Patterson remind us that, the account of Elijah's ministry in 1 Kings 19 is set within the long account of Elijah's ministry. This means we simply cannot isolate chapter 19 from the grand narrative arc that precedes it. Imagine trying to understand the resolution of a great film without having seen the rising action and the climax. It would be impossible and the emotional weight would be lost entirely. The narrative of Elijah is meticulously structured to draw the reader into a profound theological realization regarding the nature of prophetic ministry. The textbook outlines this structure beautifully by stating, composed in dramatic narrative, chapters 17 through 19 have a distinct literary structure built around a plot line concerning the story of Elijah's service of Yahweh. The authors break this down into 6 distinct phases. We begin with the prologue in chapter 17, where Elijah is initially called by God. Then, the development phase takes us to Zarephath, establishing his reliance on divine provision. The tension builds in the crisis, which is Elijah's bold message to King Ahab, and completely explodes in the climax on Mount Carmel where Elijah confronts the prophets of Baal. But the story does not end at the climax, and this is crucial. It moves into the denouement, which is Elijah's exhausted flight to Mount Horeb in chapter 19, and finally settles in the epilogue with the call of Elisha. By recognizing this literary framework, we as interpreters are prevented from ripping verses out of context. We see that Elijah's moment of despair in chapter 19 is not an isolated incident of weak faith, but a deeply human denouement following a period of intense spiritual and physical exertion. This structured approach allows us to apply the text more faithfully, understanding that our own spiritual journeys also involve prologues, intense climaxes, and sometimes, periods of overwhelming exhaustion and necessary denouement. Historical and literary dimensions, characterization in prophetic narrative. As we move deeper into our practical application, we must carefully look at how the biblical authors crafted their characters. The textbook states, as for characterization, Elijah is clearly the protagonist, while Jezebel serves as the antagonist. This might seem like an obvious observation, but understanding the depth and function of these roles is absolutely crucial for accurate exegesis. Jezebel is not just a generic bad person placed in the story for conflict. She represents the complete and total spiritual corruption of Israel at a systemic level. The authors note, her consistently bad conduct and attitude thus make her to be viewed as a flat character. In literary terms, a flat character does not fundamentally change or develop over time. Jezebel's unyielding, static wickedness serves as a stark, dark background against which Elijah's highly dynamic, fluctuating faith is severely tested. Furthermore, the text introduces the vital exegetically concept of a literary foil. The authors observe, serving as a literary foil, the angel provides a striking contrast with Elijah as a servant of the Lord. While Elijah is fleeing in absolute terror, sitting under a broom tree and wishing for his own death, the angel appears as the steadfast, perfectly obedient servant providing necessary nourishment. And here is the application point for us today. We often view the protagonist of a biblical story as a flawless, untouchable hero. But the biblical narrative is profoundly and beautifully honest. The text reminds us, Gone is the obedient servant of Yahweh who at God's direction was fed by ravens. In his place is a fearful, disillusioned, and broken man. By recognizing these intricate character dynamics, we can properly apply the text to our own lives and ministries, acknowledging that even the greatest, most powerful spiritual leaders experience profound moments of despair. In those moments, they desperately need the sustaining grace and intervention of God, powerfully represented here by the ministering angel. Theological application, finding Yahweh in the mundane. When we synthesize the historical facts and the literary structures, we finally arrive at the theological application. This is where the ancient text powerfully intersects with our daily lives. The authors make a profound statement regarding the true center of the biblical narrative. They write, although the storyline features Elijah throughout the denouement, in the ultimate sense it is Yahweh who is the true hero. This is a highly critical hermeneutical shift that we must make. We are very often tempted to make the human biblical characters the heroes of the text, looking up to them as ultimate moral examples. But the narrative consistently and aggressively points beyond them to God's ultimate sovereignty. God is the one who intimately nourishes the fleeing prophet, graciously admonishes him in the cave, and eventually restores him back to active service. Moreover, the text brings us to an incredibly powerful spiritual realization about how God typically operates in the world. The authors conclude their exegesis by stating, the believer's place is simply that of humble and obedient service to the Lord and his leading in the everyday occurrences of life. Elijah experienced the spectacular, earth-shattering fire from heaven on Mount Carmel, but God's most intimate and restorative communication with him happened in a gentle whisper at Mount Horeb. The application for our congregations and our own personal spiritual lives is profoundly countercultural. Living for God does not always mean moving endlessly from one spectacular, miraculous mountaintop event to another. In fact, most of our service and sanctification occurs in the realm of mundane, everyday realities. We must learn to actively listen for God's gentle whisper in the quiet, ordinary, and sometimes boring moments of life, trusting wholeheartedly that the true hero of our life story is Yahweh himself, who sustains us faithfully for the long journey ahead. 10 Guidelines for Interpreting Old Testament Historical Narrative, Part 1. Having seen a highly practical example in the exegesis of 1 Kings 19, we now look at the specific, formalized guidelines provided by Kosenberger and Patterson to apply to any Old Testament historical narrative. Guideline 1 states, determine the limits or boundaries of the narrative at hand, while recognizing its internal structural features. Just as we clearly saw the 6-part structure in the Elijah narrative, we must always establish exactly where a biblical story begins and where it ends to absolutely avoid lifting a text out of its proper context. Guideline 2 reminds us to consider whether the narrative mode is direct, descriptive, dramatic, or commentary. Recognizing how the author is choosing to tell the story fundamentally changes how we receive and interpret its meaning. The authors also challenge us deeply with Guideline 4, come to grips with the respective roles of the author, reader, narrator, and narratee. We must actively try to put ourselves in the place of the implied reader. When we read the text today, we are not the original audience. We have to mentally and intellectually transport ourselves back to ancient Israel. We have to hear the story with their cultural ears, understand their political and historical struggles, and feel their theological anxieties. Only by rigorously respecting these initial structural boundaries and contextual roles can we successfully bridge the vast historical gap and bring an accurate, life-changing application into our modern context without distorting the Word of God. 10 Guidelines for Interpreting Old Testament Historical Narrative, Part 2. Continuing with our practical guidelines, we move into the internal mechanics of the story itself. Guideline 6 strongly urges us to look carefully for the flow of the story. Identify such features of the plot as its beginning, middle, denouement, resolution, and epilogue. Every biblical plot has a specific trajectory, and the core theological meaning is very often found in precisely how the central conflict is resolved by God. Guideline 8 is equally important for our exegesis and application. It says, learn to appreciate the author's literary style, considering such features as dialogue, repetition, highlighting, irony, and satire. The biblical authors were brilliant, inspired literary craftsmen. When they repeat a phrase 3 times, it is never accidental. When they use heavy irony, they are intentionally subverting our expectations to make a piercing theological point about human pride or idolatry. Finally, the ultimate goal of all our exegetically work is found in Guideline 10. The authors command us, drawing all of these data together, make a proper application to the contemporary situation. Ask how the narrative impacts the reader or hearer's spiritual life. Academic exegesis is entirely incomplete if it merely produces a dry historical report. We must ask the difficult pastoral questions. How does this ancient text challenge our modern cultural idols? How does it comfort us in our present, tangible suffering? The hermeneutical triad of history, literature, and theology must always culminate in a transformative, life-altering encounter with the living Word of God. Transitioning to poetry, the power and dynamics of parallelism. As we conclude our study on historical narrative, we transition to another dominant and beautiful genre in Scripture, which is poetry. Just as narratives have their own specific rules, poetry requires a distinct hermeneutical approach. The authors note, the most recurring feature of Hebrew poetry is repetition. This can be seen especially in the poet's use of parallelism. Parallelism is truly the engine that drives biblical poetry. It is the practice of using corresponding thoughts or phrases over succeeding lines to build a concept. But we must be very careful not to oversimplify this in our exegesis. The textbook quotes the renowned scholar Robert Alter, observing that where similar parallelism does occur, there is a heightening or intensifying of meaning. It is almost never merely saying the exact same thing twice. There is an advance, a crescendo of thought and emotion. For example, when Psalm 19 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God," and the next line says, "The skies proclaim the works of his hands," the second line takes the abstract cosmic glory and makes it deeply personal and active, showing God as an intimate artisan working with his hands. We also see antithetic parallelism, where lines display a sharp, undeniable contrast. Proverbs 14 powerfully declares, "Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a disgrace to any people." In our application, we must teach our listeners to feel the heavy weight of these contrasts, allowing the poetic structure to imprint the theological truth directly onto their hearts, forcing them to choose the path of wisdom over the path of destruction. Progressive and emblematic parallelism in exegesis. Moving well beyond simple similarities and contrasts, we encounter progressive parallelism, which is a powerful literary tool used for building intense theological climaxes. The authors explain, with progressive parallelism, a succeeding line or line supplements and/or completes the first line. A beautiful and common example is found in the concept of staircase parallelism, where successive lines rhythmically lead to a grand completion of a thought. Psalm 96 commands, "Sing to the Lord a new song," and builds up step by step to, proclaim his salvation day after day. The poetry leads the reader inevitably to the ultimate call to action. We also see emblematic parallelism, which operates dynamically through similes. The textbook highlights Psalm 103, "As a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him." The authors make a brilliant point that this comparison invites an argument a fortiori, which means arguing from the lesser to the greater. If a flawed, limited human father can show deep compassion for his child, how much more infinite, perfect, and overwhelming is the compassion of our Heavenly Father. When we apply this in our teaching, counseling, and preaching, we must not rush past the imagery. We must dwell deeply on the emblem, the image of the loving Father, allowing the emotional resonance of the poetry to break open the listener's heart to the profound theological truth of God's unstoppable grace. The poetic trinity, terseness, concreteness, and imagery. Hebrew poetry is absolutely not characterized by abstract philosophical rambling. It is sharp, vivid, and deeply grounded in reality. The textbook outlines 3 critical characteristics that we must master. The first is terseness. The authors note, poets have a way of stating their thoughts so concisely that the result is a polished and succinct presentation free of unnecessary details. Every single word carries maximum theological impact. Second is concreteness. Quoting Michael Travers, the text says, "Poetry allows the reader to see, taste, touch, smell, or hear the matters, which the poet portrays." We see this vividly in the poetic account of Jael and Sisera in Judges chapter 5. The poetic text doesn't just dryly report that she killed him. It says, she struck Sisera, she crushed his head, she shattered and pierced his temple. The language is intensely visceral, concrete, and physical. The third characteristic is imagery. The authors state, imagery is a concise way of writing, because an image conveys not only information but also evokes an emotional response. We see this heavily in the use of anthropomorphisms, attributing human body parts to God, and zoomorphisms, like comparing God's fierce protection to a bird covering us with its feathers. In our exegetically application, we must vigorously resist the urge to turn these vibrant, living images into dry theological bullet points. We must let the poetry do its intended work, sparking the imagination and deeply engaging the emotions of our audience. Poetry in the New Testament, the poetic voice of Jesus and the Apostles. A very common and tragic mistake in hermeneutics is assuming that poetry is exclusively an Old Testament phenomenon. However, our application must aggressively extend to the New Testament as well. The textbook insightfully points out, with the possible exception of Luke, the New Testament authors were all Jewish by background. When it came to poetry, therefore, they would likely think in terms of Old Testament precedents. This means the parallelism and imagery we have studied are fully and vibrantly present in the teachings of Jesus and the writings of the Apostles. The textbook quotes Leland Ryken, stating, "The leading poet of the New Testament is of course Jesus. His sermons are completely saturated with metaphors and similes. He taught in mind-engaging pictures, like the good tree bearing good fruit, or the stark contrast of the wide and narrow gates." Furthermore, we see magnificent poetic structures in texts like the profound prologue to John's Gospel. By reading John chapter 1 as poetry, focusing heavily on the rhythmic interplay of light and darkness, the Word and the world, we gain an entirely new perspective. The dense theological discourses suddenly become alive with new dramatic dimensions of structure, sight, and sound. Our application of biblical interpretation must joyfully embrace the poetic nature of the New Testament, recognizing that eternal truth is often most powerfully conveyed not through cold syllogisms, but through beautiful, inspired poetry. Structural devices, cola, strophes, stanzas, and indicators. To fully master the application of poetry, we must understand its internal architectural building blocks. The textbook introduces us to the basic unit, the colon. A monocolon stands completely alone, often introducing a profound thought or functioning as a sudden, dramatic break, like the prophet Joel crying out, "Bring down your warriors, O Lord." The text explains, parallel thought over two successive lines is commonly known as a bicolon. This is the absolute bread and butter of wisdom literature like the Proverbs. These lines logically combine to form strophes, which then build into larger stanzas, creating the full poem. But how do we accurately navigate this complex architecture? The authors point us directly to structural indicators. One crucial technique is bookending, or inclusio. The text defines this as the technique of returning at the end of a unit to a theme, subject, or words mentioned at the beginning. Just like physical bookends hold a row of books securely together, an inclusio clearly marks the theological boundaries of a passage. Another vital device is stitching, which is the practice of linking successive units by means of repeating a specific word or phrase. When we do exegesis, tracing these structural devices is exactly like following a map meticulously drawn by the author. It totally prevents us from getting lost in the minor details and ensures we understand the main structural flow and the central theological message the poet intended to communicate to us. Chiastic and bifid structures, unlocking the core message. In our final slide of this seminar, we examine advanced symmetrical structures that are absolutely vital for drawing out the central theological application of a poetic text. The first is the chiastic structure. The authors explain, in chiastic structure, the second half of a composition takes up the same words, themes, or motifs as in the first half, but in reverse order. This creates an A prime pattern. The true beauty of a chiasm is that it points inward. The two parts are united around a common core that can form the most prominent idea or intended emphasis of the author. If you find the center of the chiasm, you have found the beating theological heartbeat of the passage. The second structure is the bifid structure, which means, the poet's structuring of his material in two parts, each answering to the other in similar or corresponding fashion. We see this powerfully in the prophecies of Nahum and Zephaniah, where heavy declarations of doom are perfectly balanced by descriptions and applications. We also must not ignore subtle stylistic devices like rhyme, assonance, and alliteration. While these are often sadly hidden in English translations, these acoustic devices made the text highly memorable and emotionally resonant for the original audience. As we conclude this session, remember that whether we are dealing with historical narrative or intricate poetry, our ultimate goal is to apply the hermeneutical triad faithfully. We must deeply understand the history, meticulously master the literature, and ultimately, let the radiant theology transform our lives and the lives of those we teach.